Alright, so my study is Perry et al. And it was performed in 2015, and the psychology being investigated is interpersonal distance. Alright, so what is the approach being used? The approach being used is the social approach. And basically, in this approach, it measures how people interact and are exposed to social situations based on their mental state. And in this study, we are going to be focusing on the empathy mental state. So some strengths of this study is that it can help to explain social behavior in social situations, and it tends to be holistic in explanations. So basically, it is very good at explaining how different people interact in social experiences. And then a weakness is that it lacks generalizability, and this is typically due to culture, time period, and gender. And in this study, gender is especially what creates this lack of generalizability because of its all male sample, so it cannot be applied to any females whatsoever. Alright, so some background. We have oxytocin and the amygdala. The oxytocin is a hormone suspected to be important in social bonding, trust, and compassion, and the amygdala is responsible for the control of emotions and behaviors, and this can be regulated by oxytocin. Alright, so some background on social salience. Social salience is the degree to which something sticks out in a sea of information, and this is basically the degree to how a person reacts in a social situation and the effects that might influence this. And then the social salience hypothesis is if oxytocin increases attention to social cues, it will have widely varying effects depending on interpersonal context. So basically, one person might find a situation relaxing and comfortable, while another might find it uncomfortable and terrifying. Alright, so now some background on empathy. So empathy is the way in which we comfort each other by imagining what it's like to be in another situation. So some 4 measures of empathy are perspective taking, empathic concern, emotional distress, and fantasy abilities. So in perspective taking, this is basically taking the perspective of another person and seeing what it's like to be in their shoes. And empathic concern is feeling concern for somebody whenever they're going through a hard time and you're just trying to be there for them to make them feel better. Personal distress is whenever you feel distressed for somebody if they're going through a hard time. And then fantasy abilities is being able to fantasize or imagine what they're going through and put yourself directly in their point of view and their shoes. And then in the study, we use the IRI, which is Interpersonal Reactivity Index, to measure the levels of empathy in the participants, so either the high or the low empathy group. And this is a 28-item questionnaire taken as a self-report measure. So some background on spatial distance. So spatial distance is the distance between one person and another or a group of people. And this has 4 zones of this spatial distance. So the first zone is in the intimate zone, which you would share with a close person, like a romantic partner or a really close friend, and that's going to be 18 inches or less. Then we have the personal zone, which is 1.5 to 4 feet. And this would be like what you would share with like a friend or maybe a classmate. And then we have the social zone, which is 4 to 12 feet. And this would be anywhere in a social environment where you would be interacting with others that you are familiar with. You might not be super close with them. So this could be like your peers or maybe a coworker. And then the public zone is 12 feet or more, and this would be if you're in a really wide open space around most likely strangers who you would not go super close to because you don't know them, or if any other factors may contribute to that, you would stay far away. All right, now the psychology being investigated. The main psychology being investigated is interpersonal distance. And once again, this is how we regulate how closely we interact with others. So this is flexible. So if you take a space bubble, for instance, people with a more extroverted kind of mindset, they would have a bigger space bubble. So they don't mind having people close to them, but some people might be introverted, so that means they'd have a small space bubble and they really don't want people being close to them. And then we have the social hormones, which in this study were centered around oxytocin, and this can help in regulation and social bonding, trust, and compassion. And then we have empathy, which is the ability to share someone else's psychological state and understand exactly what they're going through by putting yourself in their shoes. So the aim of the study is to investigate whether oxytocin affects interpersonal distance, otherwise known as personal space, in people who are seen as having stronger empathic skills. So basically to see if oxytocin administration given to high empathy individuals would have any correlation to their interpersonal distance preference. So basically seeing if people with high empathy would become more extroverted when giving oxytocin and vice versa. So the hypothesis of this study, so in experiment 1, it would be that higher empathy individuals would want the figures closer to them and they would become more extroverted and whenever given oxytocin, and then less empathetic individuals will want people further away from them, otherwise known as the figure approaching them in experiment 1, and this is after the administration of oxytocin. And then experiment 2 would be that to see if preferred distances and angles for experiment would be affected both by oxytocin and empathic levels of participants. And the empathic levels of the participants was determined by the IRI, the Interpersonal Reactivity Index. So the sample was 54 male participants, however, only 40 were included in the actual study and were separated into either the high or the low empathy group. They were aged 19 to 32, and they were all undergrad students from the University of Haifa in Israel. 5 of them were left-handed, and all of them had normal vision, and this could have been corrected by glasses or contacts. It just had to make sure that they could participate in both experiments effectively without producing confounding results. And then all of them had no reported neurological or physiological disorders, and again, this would prevent them from participating in both experiments. And then they were also paid and compensated through course credit or payment, so that this would get them to want to participate more in the study. And the sampling technique is not mentioned, so we don't know if it's opportunity or volunteer. It was just not mentioned at all. All right, so the experimental design was independent and repeated measures. So independent, this was each participant was only in either the high or the low empathy group, and this was not repeated. And then for both experiments, and then repeated measures for both experiments was that they were in both the oxytocin and the placebo group. So 1 week they were in oxytocin, and then the next week, a week later, they were in the placebo group, or vice versa, because this was counterbalanced. So in experiment 1, this was all participants were exposed to the friend, the ball authority figure, and the stranger, and they were witness to this many times, so this is repeated. And in experiment 2, they were all exposed to the different room types between like the chair distances and the angles of the chairs, etc., for a personal discussion 2 weeks later. All right, so the research methods. So first we have a lab experiment, and this study is a lab experiment because it was performed in a quiet room and in a lab setting, and it was very standardized. And then we have self-report, which was from the IRI, the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, and this would decide if they were in the high empathy or low empathy group, and this was self-report. All right, now for a recap. So this is in fact the social approach, and this basically determines how people interact in social situations based off of their mental state. And remember that empathy is the mental state we are focusing on in this study. The psychology being investigated is interpersonal distance, the distance we are between others and how we interact around them. And then we have the social hormone, oxytocin, which is very crucial to deciding how people are in social bonding, trust, and compassion. And then empathy is like how we comfort each other by understanding what they're going through and trying to put ourselves in their shoes. Our aim is to investigate whether oxytocin affects interpersonal distance in people who are seen as having high empathic skills. And then our hypothesis is high empathy participants will have a decrease in need for personal space after the administration of oxytocin, and low empathy individuals will need increased personal space after the administration of oxytocin. So basically, people who are highly empathetic with oxytocin will become more extroverted, and to see if people with low empathy when given oxytocin will become more introverted. And then the sample was 54 males, but only 40 were included in the actual study and were separated into either the high or the low empathy group. They were aged 19 to 32, all enrolled in the undergrad. They were all undergrads at the University of Haifa in Israel, and they all had normal vision, and this could have been corrected by glasses or contacts. None of them had psychiatric disorders that would prevent them from being included in the study to perform like valid results, and they were paid and compensated for their participation by course credit or just payment. And the sampling technique was not mentioned. So the experimental design was independent and repeated measures. For independent, this was, if you remember, when they were in either the high or the low empathy group, and this was not repeated, so they were in either or. And then for repeated, this was they received both the oxytocin and the placebo like 1 week apart, so they experienced all of that. And then for experiment 1, they were exposed to the friend, the ball, authority figure, and the stranger approaching them in experiment 1 on the CID, which we will get into later. And in experiment 2, they were all exposed to the preferred room choice, and this varied in chair distance and chair angle, plant angle, etc. And then our research method is lab experiment because it was in a quiet room in a lab setting. And then we have self-report from the IRI, which was the Interpersonal Reactivity Index, and this decided if they're in the high or the low empathy group. So the independent and dependent variables. So for the independent variables, this was the empathy conditioned, either the high or the low empathy, and you cannot be in both groups, you had to be either or. And then we have the treatment type, which is oxytocin or placebo, and this was repeated, so they were in both a week apart. And then for experiment 1, this was the figure approaching them, whether it be the friend, the ball, authority figure, or the stranger, and they were given all of these in experiment 1 on the CID. And then experiment 2, this was the distance between chairs, chair and the plant, angles of chairs, and the angle of table to the plant. So basically the choices of the rooms they could have picked. And then for the dependent variables in experiment 1, this was the preferred distance chosen depending on the figure approaching them. And then this was measured for percentage distance between the remaining two figures, so basically calculated an average, and this was the dependent variable for experiment 1. And then for experiment 2, this was the preferred room chosen for a personal topics discussion. All right, now on to apparatus and materials. So for both experiments 1 and 2, they were exposed to the oxytocin and the placebo, and the placebo was made out of saline solution, and this didn't really do anything. It was just so it would be counterbalanced. And now we have the interpersonal reactivity index, the IRI, which decided if they're in the high or the low empathy group. Then we have the quiet room with the Nature is Real magazine, and basically this magazine helped them to prevent social interactions so that it would not confound the results in the study. And in experiment 1, this was a CID, the computerized program, and this is what they took to measure how their comfortability between different figures, whether it be the friend, the ball, authority figure, or the stranger. And then experiment 2, these were the colored pictures of the rooms. So now for the procedures for experiment 1 and 2, the participants came to the lab 2 times 1 week apart, and they were exposed to either oxytocin or the placebo group. So this was a double blind because the first week they would come, it would be randomly assigned, and neither the experimenter nor the participant knew which group they were being placed in. So this would control for confounding variables, and then, or demand characteristics. And then they applied 3 drops of either the oxytocin or the placebo to each nostril. And then they would have to complete the online version of the IRI, the interpersonal reactivity index, to see which group they would be sorted into, either the high or the low empathy group. And then they had to wait 45 minutes to let the oxytocin set in, and they were given the Israel Nature magazine so that they would prevent social interaction that might influence the study, and they did not want that. And then they began one of the experiments, and the order was counterbalanced, so they could have started with experiment 1, or they could have started with experiment 2, and this was basically just to control for order effects. All right, now for the procedure for experiment 1, this was the computerized model of the CID, the comfortable interpersonal distance. So basically, the participant was shown the name of the approaching figure, either the friend, the ball, authority figure, or the stranger, for 1 second, and this would just flash on the screen just to tell them what to expect. And then there was a fixation point for 0.5 seconds. Basically, this would represent the participant and told them that they would be standing in the center of the room with a circle around them. And then they would show a still picture of the figure, and it was just for 1 second from the figure from 8 different interests of the choices that they could have got. And then this was shown for 1 second. After the 1 second, the figure began approaching them, and for 3 seconds it would come closer and closer. However, the participant would be able to stop them from moving if they would click the space bar, and this would basically tell them what distance they were comfortable with, how close they would be. So basically, each of the 4 figures appeared at each of the 8 interests on 3 different occasions. Thus, the figure had a total of 24 trials in all. So this would be an example of what they might see. So this person was given stranger, but remember, they could have had the friend, the ball, the stranger, or the authority figure. They were just given the stranger. And this was shown for 1 second. Then very soon after, they were shown this fixation point for only 0.5 seconds, and this represented the participant. And then after, this fixation point turned into a stick figure, which also represented the participant, and this circular room was created around them, with this figure being outside of the circle. And this was a still picture for only 1 second. And then after that, it began moving closer, as you can see here, for 3 seconds, or until the spacebar was pressed to stop the figure from approaching. All right, now the procedure for experiment 2. The participants were told that they would later sit in a room to have a personal topic discussion with another participant. So this would basically increase their attention so that they would pick a room that is most comfortable for them to be in. So they were shown 2 pictures of 2 different rooms that would vary about like their chair distance or the chair angles or the distance between the table and the chair, etc., things like that. And then it would calculate an average room based off their choices to determine which room they would be more comfortable in for a personal topics discussion. And these were colored pictures, so they're pretty realistic, kind of. And then there was a total of 84 pictures chosen, which means they had a total of 168 options. So this would be an example of what they might see. Again, they were only shown 2, but here are 4 examples. As you can see, these chairs right here are pointed away or are angled a little more than these. And if you can see here, these chairs are further apart than these. So someone who has high empathy and was given oxytocin, they would most likely pick these 2 chairs because they're close together and facing each other, versus a person with low empathy who was given oxytocin would most likely pick these chairs because they are pointed a little bit further away and are further apart. And then as you can see, the table angles and distance between the chairs and the plant angles varied for each picture. So participants could have many different variables that would affect their preferred room choice. All right, now for the results of experiment 1. So basically, each pairing was significantly different except for the friend versus the ball. So none of the participants really found the friend or the ball very different. So they were the same like threat level, versus like if you did the ball versus stranger, people are definitely going to be more threatened by the stranger than the ball. So they would want the stranger further away as the ball closer because they don't feel threatened by the ball. And the friend and the ball were pretty similar in distance preferred. So this was pretty different compared to the rest. And then the common trend was that the high empathy participants who received oxytocin had a decreased need for interpersonal distance. So for all of the figures, they were all further away compared to the low empathy participants who also had oxytocin administration. So this basically proves that people with high empathy become more extroverted when exposed to oxytocin. However, low empathy participants were shown to have decreased personal space, so they would want people further away from them after the administration of oxytocin. So basically, when you give oxytocin to people with low empathy, they become more introverted. And then there was a significant interaction between oxytocin, high empathy, and the condition. So as you can see here, as I was explaining up here, whenever you have the friend versus the authority figure, people tend to have closer distance for the friends because they're less threatening. And same for friend versus stranger, friend closer, less threatening. And same, that's for the high empathy placebo, and then same for the high empathy oxytocin, friend versus authority, closer for friend, friend versus stranger, closer for friend, ball versus stranger, closer for ball, and then ball versus authority, closer for the ball. Now for the results for experiment 2, there were significant results reported for chair distances. So basically, people with high and low empathy had very different preferences when it came to chair distance. So the people with high empathy were most likely picking the close chairs and were pointed towards each other with the administration of oxytocin, and people with low empathy would choose the chairs further apart and angled away from each other with the administration of oxytocin. So there were no other compared statistic that there was no other comparisons that reached statistical significance. So there was no preference between plant angle and table angle. It didn't really matter. They were just really concerned about the chair angle and the distance. And in the high empathy group, there was a trend towards oxytocin decreasing interpersonal distance compared to the placebo. So once again, people who have high empathy and received oxytocin became more extroverted than before. So now for conclusions, the enhancement of social cues following oxytocin administration may have opposite effects depending on different empathic traits. So people with high and low empathy when given oxytocin have very different preferences when it comes to interpersonal distance. And then people with high empathic abilities tend to have smaller zones of interpersonal distance, so it would be more of like a personal zone or an intimate zone preference. And then people with low empathy would have an increase in interpersonal distance, so this would most likely be like the social level or the public zone. And then there is support for the social salience hypothesis. So basically, people in different mental states have different outlooks on the experiment. So people who have high empathy were pretty comfortable with both experiments, but people with low empathy were pretty uncomfortable in the situation. So now the evaluation of strengths. This was a lab experiment, so it had many controls, including that all participants were exposed to both the oxytocin and the placebo, which was a double blind, and which meaning that neither the experimenter or the participant knew which one they were receiving and at what time. And Perry could be confident that oxytocin and empathic levels was significantly affecting interpersonal distance, therefore this increased validity. And then this is a standardized procedure, so all participants had the same CID, the comfortable interpersonal distance computerized program, the same instructions, the same pictures of rooms, and the same IRI, the same self-report, interpersonal reactivity index. And this study is easy to replicate, so other scientists or experimenters can replicate the study to see if they get the same results. And then this study does have quantitative data, so this would increase the validity and reliability of the results because they are in numbers and tend to be the same across all experiments. So now for the evaluation of weaknesses, this has social desirability bias and demand characteristics. So basically, people on the IRI could have made themselves seem more empathetic to make them seem like a better person, so this may confound the results. This study also had low mundane realism because the CID in particular is not exactly how a real life situation would go, since these are not actual figures approaching them, they are just like a word and a stick figure, which is not very realistic, so therefore decreasing the mundane realism. And then there were closed questions in the IRI, so the questions and answers may not have been good and specific enough for each participant because everybody's different, and it could have been not specific enough. Oh, and also this study has low generalizability because of the all male sample, so this is not generalized to females at all, so this does decrease the generalizability. So now for issues and debates. So some strengths is that the participants received informed consent and were debriefed, so they were definitely aware of all features of the study. And some weaknesses is that the imagery of a stranger or an authority figure or the friend or the ball could have been stressful for the participants if they're more introverted. And then the expectation in experiment 2 to have the personal discussions in one of the rooms, even though this did not happen, they were still expecting this to happen to them. So this could have been stressful to them leading up for that if they were more introverted. So now for nature versus nurture. So oxytocin is a biological hormone, so this directly impacts their biological traits. So this is in nature. And then for nurture, people in experiment based their stub judgments in experiment 1 and their preferred room choice in experiment 2 based off their real life experiences, so their past experiments before the study. And then for application to everyday life, this could be useful when hiring people for a job to see if they work well with other people. They can be given the CID, the comfortable interpersonal distance computerized program, or the IRI to determine if they would work well in these situations, if they have high or low empathy. So if they have low empathy, they might not be the best co-worker in closer spaces. And then people with high empathy can eat more oxytocin producing foods like avocados or mushrooms, and this would basically make them less stressed if they have to be around like a big group of people or just lots of people in general. And then for individual versus situational, so individual was they were placed in the high or the low empathy level based off of their own preferences and their own score on the IRI. So this was very individual. And then for the situation, the process of having to choose when to stop the approaching figure was in the situation in experiment 1, and then in experiment 2, this was having to choose the preferred room choice by the nature of the situation. So now for a quick review. So in the experiments, there were 54 male participants aged 19 to 32. However, only 40 were used in the actual study. So that was either being in the high or the low empathy group. And this was performed in a lab setting, so it was very standardized, and there was independent and repeated measures. And then for the independent variables, this was the high or the low empathy group, the treatment, which was the oxytocin or the placebo, and then empathy level, which was, the experiment conditions, which in experiment 1, this was like the figure approaching them and having to stop them. And then in experiment 2, this was the preferred room choice, the choices for the rooms. And then for the DV, in experiment 1, this was the distance chosen when figure was approaching. And for the experiment 2, this was the preferred room choice of what they actually chose. And the hypothesis was proven. High empathy participants who receive oxytocin tend to have less personal space, like less preference for personal space, so they don't mind people are closer to them, versus people with low empathy who received oxytocin became more introverted and required more personal space. And then ethics, they had informed consent and were debriefed. However, this could have been stressful for participants if they're more introverted. And that is everything. Thank you so much for watching, and have so much fun on the Super Fun Review Game.